Hello and welcome, folks. It is time for my second installment in this How to Make Elder Scrolls 6 sort of series. So in the last one we talked about some philosophical changes that I suggest Bethesda and Microsoft consider. In this one we're going to get into some specifics. Firstly, a dilemma that creatives often face when receiving criticism is how do you know who to listen to? The loudest voices are often the exact kind of person that one should not listen to. And I do think that some of Bethesda's recent troubles are the result of listening to the wrong people. So how can Bethesda filter out the valuable criticism from the nonsense? Well, in this case, beware the nostalgia bias. Many Bethesda fans favor whichever Fallout or Elder Scrolls game they played first, and this can blind them from seeing things objectively. A notable example is a lot of fans whose first Elder Scrolls game was Oblivion prefer some aspects of that game that the majority of the millions of Skyrim fanatics do not. Like the old school RPG player progression and the class systems, which we're going to talk in more detail about later. A big reason for Skyrim's mass popularity beyond any other Bethesda game is that Bethesda moved away from that old school way of thinking. They took Elder Scrolls and they simplified it to the point that anyone can pick it up and play it. Then tens of millions of people did. So when analyzing data, the key question is, why did both the fanbase that Bethesda had established by 2011 and millions of new players love Skyrim? To that end, here are two more specific questions to ask. What do fans that say Oblivion is their favorite Elder Scrolls game prefer about Skyrim? What do fans that say Skyrim is their favorite Elder Scrolls game prefer about other Bethesda games? Asking those questions will yield some extremely valuable insight. Now it's time to talk specifics. Let's start with the more nuts and bolts kinds of things, then we'll move on to the more creative decisions after. Since ES6 is all but confirmed to take place in Hammerfell, some fans are wondering if Bethesda is considering going back to Daggerfall's massive scale. Bethesda, for the love of Talos, please leave the scale the same as Skyrim's. As in, assuming that Skyrim's in-game map is the size of Skyrim on this map, the size of Hammerfell's map in relation to that should be the size of Hammerfell on this map. A big part of why more recent Bethesda games have lost the richness of Skyrim is because, as they've put it, they've gotten irresponsible with their scales. Skyrim is so rich because there's a huge variety of characters, stories, flora, fauna, lore, mysteries, etc. jam-packed into the province of Skyrim. Lately, they, and really a lot of developers in the industry right now, have just been going big for the sake of big like it's supposed to impress us. But what's the good of size if you're not satisfied? No. Nope. Just gonna invite myself not to finish, not to end that sentence. Alright. Let me try again. What's the point of big if you're not effectively use... Alright. This is why I don't wing it more often, folks. So in summary here, scale is something that Jill Braff and Microsoft execs need to have their eyes on, because if the devs try to go irresponsibly big like they have recently, ES6 is going to be Starfield all over again. It'll launch well, but shortly after, the number of players actively playing will plummet. The reviews will say it's a massive empty world devoid of substance, and so on. Let's not do that again. If this is how big Skyrim is, then whatever's going into ES6 must be the size that it is here in relation to Skyrim. So like I keep saying, content is the #1 priority. Do not try to wow us with tech gimmicks, focus on content. However, I'm a realistic man, and I realize that Bethesda is going to try something. So I'm at least going to suggest some things they could try that wouldn't be bad ideas. Things that, in my non-developer opinion, I think Bethesda can execute in addition to making a Skyrim's worth of quality-rich content without having to make compromises for either one. But if I'm wrong about that, sacrifice the tech, not the content. So what are some techie things Bethesda can do that would be welcome? Well, there is an obvious thing that comes to mind that I actually would like. What if they really took combat to the next level? One of the only things that most Skyrim players, including ones that say it's their favorite Bethesda game, consistently agree on is that the combat gets boring. So how can it get better? Well, what if they did really start from the ground up and tried making a more methodical or action-reaction combat system? There is a specific game that comes to mind and has me thinking, you know, this combat in an Elder Scrolls game would be legendary, and that's Jedi Survivor. That combat is fun. I spend hours just running around trying different ways of fighting all the kinds of enemies in there. Imagine playing an Elder Scrolls game that has combat like this with all these parries, dodges, finishers, quick time events, and all that. That would be so much fun. And maybe how exactly it all works changes based on what you have equipped. Like if you have a sword and shield, there's certain animations with that, but it changes a bit if you have a sword in one hand and magic in the other. The challenge here is how would you get combat like this to work with magic and with archery, but you know it can work. Magic would require giving the player access to a lot of button mapping customization, so that we're not constantly having to pause and change spells in the middle of the action. And how would blocks work with magic? Well, I'm thinking that deflection spells like Stone Flesh are going to take the place of a shield for mages. Like when they hit whatever button they have the block spell synced up with, their hand will flash and that big oval that we're all familiar with will pop up and deflect the attacks. And what about archers? Well, essentially what I'm thinking here is Legolas from Lord of the Rings. So folks, I know that I'm undermining myself a bit here, but I think combat like what I just described combined with a Skyrim's worth of quality rich content would be one of the best video games ever made. It would instantly win Game of the Year and break multiple sales records. Another thing that fans have been asking for since before Skyrim is co-op play. In all fairness, it's not as simple a request as a lot of fans think it is, but it's doable. I mean, modders did it. And you know, Bethesda did an online Fallout game, but they've never given us co-op in a main series Fallout or Elder Scrolls game. So maybe ES6 will be the game where they finally do it, and I'm all for it. Another technical suggestion I have is making boats and carriages that actually move. Imagine how neat it would be to look out over Sentinel's ports and actually see boats coming and going. And imagine traveling along the roads and actually seeing caravans haul their products on carriages. That would add a nice aesthetic to the world. Also, I've seen multiple fans suggest a sailing mechanic, as in players get to build and sail their own ships. This actually shouldn't be very complicated because Bethesda already has the groundwork for it with Starfield shipbuilding and flying. With some tinkering, that technology can absolutely be adapted for boats. In summary, I'm all for any of these techie ideas so long as Bethesda keeps them simple and doesn't make any compromises when it comes to content to execute them. Now it's time to talk about creative decisions. As I think I've made clear by now, content takes precedent over all else. Here's a general breakdown of how I recommend prioritizing things. A is things that are going to matter for every single player. B is enrichment sorts of things, which I'll describe as stuff that isn't immediately related to objectives that most players will look to do, but does play a very important role by enriching the setting. Lastly, C is things that most players will not take a big interest in. Don't worry, they'll still be there and they'll still be good. I'm just suggesting that Bethesda simplify them, which I think will make them easier to develop, and frankly I think will make them better. Now let's get some specific figures on how many of each kind of quest I think ES6 should have. I find that how exactly the game guide categorizes quests can be a bit confusing, so what I've done is I've broken Skyrim's quests into my own categories. We of course need a main quest line, and let's have that consist of 18 to 24 individual quests. We also need a few faction quest lines. Skyrim actually has an extra here because of the Civil War, but for ES6 I recommend sticking to just 4 faction quest lines and using the time that would have been spent on a 5th on the other categories. So let's go 4 faction quest lines, each consisting of 10 to 17 individual quests. Next we've got what I'm calling Faction Side, which are quests that you have to be in a faction to do but aren't part of the given faction's quest line. I'm hoping for 5 to 15 of those per faction. Yes, that's a wide range, and that's because we of course want a lot of Dark Brotherhood contracts, but how many of ES6's equivalent of the ritual spell quests do we really need? Next we've got functional quests, which only exist to serve a functional purpose in the game. No point in providing a figure for these, just do however many is required to serve the game's functional needs. Now we have Radiant quests, which are those little repeatable quests that mainly exist to provide a reliable source of currency. Again, no figure for these because it's just not a priority. However many or however few of these Bethesda does is fine. Next we have side quests. I spent a lot of time trying to decide what counts as a side quest as opposed to what counts as a dungeon quest, and really it's a question of complexity. The best Bethesda games have great side quests, so let's do 55 to 60 of these. So what are dungeon quests? I decided these are quests that are meant to give dungeons substance. They give us something to take an interest in as we're battling our way through enemies but don't have much gameplay beyond the dungeon. Aim for 20 to 25 of these. There's also dungeon objectives. These are somewhere in between dungeon quests and miscellaneous objectives. 25 to 30 of these will suffice. Lastly, there's miscellaneous objectives. These are simple little things that only take a few minutes to do. While these might seem unnecessary to some players, small things like misc objectives actually play an important role in enriching the setting. And something I really like about Skyrim's misc objectives is they lead to other things. They often count towards becoming a Thane, or unlocking a potential marriage candidate, getting a new companion, etc. And that goes a long way in making us feel like our actions in that world have purpose. So I hope Bethesda returns to having misc objectives lead to things like this in Elder Scrolls 6, and I have some ideas on how they could take that to the next level. Maybe the rewards for misc objectives are sometimes things like new kill move animations, or new weapon or armor aesthetics. I think it would be really neat if we did a small favor for, say, a war veteran and they teach us a sword technique that unlocks a new kill move or quicktime event. Or maybe we fetch some materials for a blacksmith and they give us a new mold for a helmet or something. In summary, misc objectives are more important than most players realize because they enrich the setting, and there are ways Bethesda can play to that in the S6. Let's aim for 40 to 45 of these. Here's the complete list of how many of each kind of quest I think Bethesda should aim for in Elder Scrolls 6, which I believe to be the important figures. For Starfield, they picked some weird things to focus on. The main thing that comes to mind is I remember them emphasizing how many lines of dialogue there are. A lot of people thought that meant more quests and more characters, but in reality they just increased the amount of dialogue per character and per quest. Most of it went towards these role-playing dialogue options, which just makes every conversation too long because it takes forever to decide which thing to say. And the result is it actually feels like there's less dialogue in Starfield than in Skyrim because so little of it is actually used. So Bethesda, forget about lines of dialogue, focus on total number of quests and go off these ranges for each kind of quest. If you're looking for some figures like how many map locations should there be, or how many lines of dialogue should each quest have, then base it on what it is for Skyrim. Moving on, we should discuss city design. Bethesda's cities have gotten worse because of this big for the sake of big mentality that a lot of developers have fallen victim to. New Atlantis is their biggest city ever, but most of it is just empty space. Skyrim cities might seem small, but they're so rich because Bethesda put a lot of thought into things like clutter, and the characters are all meaningful, they all add something to the setting, and so on. So Bethesda, please think cozy with your cities. Don't just add huge plots of empty space filled with nameless NPCs. Design them so that they'll feel cozy once they're filled with meaningful characters. How many meaningful characters? About what it was for Skyrim. A similar principle applies to dungeons. Starfield has a bunch of dungeons with huge amounts of unnecessary space. I recall that the mech factory that the first uses their headquarters has these huge hallways that take forever to get through. So I really hope that Bethesda has learned their lesson from this big for the sake of big thing and returns to quality over quantity. Now for our next topic, we need to talk a bit about how to write and design mysteries, because I'm guessing that a lot of the people responsible for Skyrim's mysteries are no longer with the company. Though perhaps some old employees would be generous enough to provide some insight. It's worth an email. I didn't provide an estimate for how many mysteries there should be because frankly it needs to be uncountably high. When I play Skyrim, I still find that there are things to read into that I didn't know about. For example, I recently did an investigation into who Kunarik is. You can find that in the 5 Unsolved Skyrim Mysteries video linked at the end of this video. So I of course expected that I'd find some clues about Kunarik, but to my surprise I also found that Bethesda seems to have put a lot more thought into Shalador, the Labyrinth, and Bromjanar Sanctuary than I expected going in. So everyone needs to have mysteries in mind when writing and designing content for Elder Scrolls 6. The whole game will be better that way. The devs need to always be thinking things like how can we end this story in a way that leaves the player with questions. Like how Promises to Keep tells a complete story, but also leaves us asking questions about Louis Latrouche. Let's see, another one is how can we hide a hint about a big mystery in this dialogue, like how someone snuck a clue about the Skyforge in Yorlin's dialogue here. And there's also clutter. How can we use clutter to hint at things? Well, one general rule of thumb here is every home should have at least one thing in it that prompts a question. Maybe there's a book somewhere that suggests someone's up to no good, or there could be a hidden stash of valuables that prompts us to ask where did this come from. Maybe a note or a journal somewhere that reveals some sort of relationship we didn't know about, and so on. And that's just stuff in people's homes. When it comes to mystery, they also need to be thinking about things like dialogue, what's in people's pockets, lore, unmarked locations. It needs to be all over the game. Skyrim is so endlessly replayable because these questions make it so there's always more to discover. So if the devs constantly have mysteries on their minds when they're making Elder Scrolls 6, that game will be endlessly replayable as well. One way to get a feel for how to leave clues is to watch some fan theory videos, get a feel for how people like me, Nate, Camel go about solving them, and sort of outline in reverse. I'll also provide some insight now. Every mystery is unique. In the ones that I've tried to solve, I've found that there isn't really a formula to it. You just have to approach each one like a new thing. But something they do all have in common is that what we experience about them in the games is only a part of a bigger story. To further clarify what I mean by all these things, I'm going to break down a good example of a mystery Bethesda laid out for us in Skyrim, and after I'll break down the time that Bethesda really missed an opportunity to keep us thinking in Starfield. First, let's talk about the Skyforge, which I had so much fun covering. I mean, I love that video. I love rewatching that now, even though, man, that audio is so much worse than I thought it was at the time, but I love that video so much. There's the story that they tell us in the Companions questline with Roofrad, the Curse of the Beastblood, redeeming Kodlak and all that. But that's a story within a bigger story. There are these looming questions like who built the Skyforge, and what's the origin of the Silver Hand, etc. And the answers are in that bigger story. The best part is there are clues in the smaller story that they did tell us with the Companions, and also in other areas of the game, like in lore, which compels us to keep playing, because we can feel that there's more there. We know Bethesda wouldn't build up the Skyforge like this and draw attention to the question of who built it if there wasn't an answer. So we keep on playing, hoping that we might notice something that we didn't before. We think to ourselves, oh, there's a lot about Hircine in here, so maybe something from his Daedric quest is part of the puzzle. And Kinnereth is often depicted as a bird, maybe there's something there, and so on. And even when we're not playing, these unanswered questions keep us thinking about Skyrim, until they get us in the mood to play again. Now let's break down an opportunity to do something similar that Bethesda really missed in Starfield. The UC Vanguard questline presents us with a few intriguing questions, like where do terramorphs come from, how did so many suddenly show up at Londinian, who's creating them now, and so on. However, they told us all of those things. I don't have any unanswered questions, so nothing here is keeping me thinking about Starfield, and I'm not left wanting more. So nothing about this is going to compel me to play again. I'm never going to go to bed thinking about this because there's nothing to think about. So how could this have been executed better? Well, for the questline itself, they should have focused on the question of who's responsible for the recent attacks and only hinted at the other two questions. Perhaps on Dr. Orlace's ship he has some of those plants from Londinian in the science bay somewhere, and somewhere else he has like a book about heat leeches with details about where they're commonly found. And maybe somewhere, like in Mass somewhere, there's a laboratory that's studying heat leeches, and there's a computer entry we can read in there in which the scientist is asking the question of why he's never found a heat leech that's older than a certain age when he doesn't see any biological reason that they can't live to exceed that age. And instead of the whole transformation scene in Londinian, we simply find those plants that caused the transformation along with clues leading us back to Ve Victus. But instead of having the option to spare him, we are forced to kill him so that the secret of how he caused the attacks dies with him. That's how Bethesda could have told us the story of Ve Victus and the Sivan family, but only hinted at parts of the bigger story. By not directly telling us how they executed the attacks and what happened at Londinian, they could have left us with those unanswered questions, which would have kept us thinking about Starfield and left us wanting more. So Bethesda, for Elder Scrolls 6, remember, don't always tell us the whole story, especially for questlines. When writing a questline, start with a few questions, only answer one of them, and just hint at the answers for the others, both in the questlines and in other parts of the game, like you did an excellent job of in Skyrim, which is a big part of why Skyrim is still one of the most popular games in the world. But they also need to go back to doing the smaller mysteries, the ones that aren't immediately related to questlines or sometimes not even any quest. Like who's the mother of Balgruuf's children, the sleeping tree, and creatures make great mysteries, like what's the origin of Reeklings, what exactly are Spriggans, and so on. Even though those aren't center stage like the Skyforge, they're still important because they enrich the setting. So Bethesda, make sure you have plenty of mysteries in Elder Scrolls 6, both big and small. Always have this element of mystique in mind. I promise if you do, you'll end up with a setting that's as rich as Skyrim, if not richer. Some areas you might consider leaning into are the Yakutan settlement of Hammerfell. Maybe there's like discrepancies there, like why'd they leave Yakuta to begin with. Another thing that comes up with that lore is the left-handed elves. Maybe there's something to work with there. There's also plenty of creatures to explore, like the origin of goblins, and maybe they have some sort of hidden agenda during Elder Scrolls 6. I'm sure Bethesda has some great ideas for mysteries as well, and I can't wait to hop in there and solve them all. Now we need to further discuss what I've taken to calling the non-content aspects of the creative side of things. Going from Skyrim to Fallout 4, Bethesda started treating some of these non-content features as their own parts of the game as opposed to accessories to the content. And the result is that they're unnecessarily complicated, take more work to develop than is ideal, and end up contracting from the content more than complementing it. It's mainly sandbox mechanics that are guilty of this. I'm okay with ES6 not having any sort of sandbox, and I think a lot of other fans are as well. However, there's simply too many players that do like the sandboxes from Fallout and Starfield to do away with it now. But that doesn't mean these features can't improve in ES6, they really just need to be simplified. The main problem with the ones from Fallout 4 and Starfield is that they ask too much of the player. Fallout 4's particularly is just tycoonish, which is extremely annoying. So many fans have told me stories about how much they hate these features. I was in the middle of a long dungeon and my settlement got attacked and I couldn't do anything about it. I spent days trying to connect my whole town to an electric grid, but something's still not working right and I don't know why. I spent a day trying to get the happiness meter up, but now they're sad again. I was in the middle of building a big building, then I ran out of wood and had to run around buying shipments of wood. So how can Bethesda make a sandbox for ES6 that most players find fun and don't find frustrating? Well, where is the fun in their previous attempts at it? In the finished product. The fun part of Fallout 4's sandbox is not building settlements, it's experiencing the finished settlements. It's walking through town and seeing NPCs using the things that you built, having fun at the local tavern, using the home you built for yourself. That's what's fun about it. So to make ES6's sandbox mechanics better than Bethesda's previous attempts at it, they should make the building aspects of them way simpler to get players to the fun faster. The key principle to follow here is the less time players are planning and more time they're playing, the better. That means minimizing the time that we're looking at menus, trying to figure out how to best use our resources and all that stuff, and more time experiencing the finished product. What specific things can Bethesda do to achieve that? Well, they need to not do these tycoony things. As in, no building requirements, no materials, no happiness meter, no habitation requirements, no do-it-yourself electricity, just make the items work when we place them without us having to make them work, etc. None of those tycoony annoyances, just complete freedom to build what we want, how we want, when we want, without asking anything in return from us. Some might say that they like the realism of having to actually tend to settlements, but in reality, how many players are out there that can honestly say that they actually go around collecting building materials as opposed to whooping out cheat terminal and spawning more in? The bottom line here is doing away with the tedious tycoonish mechanics of the sandbox gets players to the fun faster, is easier to execute from a development standpoint, and ultimately results in a feature that enhances content rather than a feature that becomes a chore. And one last little side note for Bethesda here, don't let us build anywhere like you did for 76 and Starfield, do designated zones like you did for Fallout 4. This goes back to everything I said about pushing the tech needle in the last video. Building everywhere just opens up a huge technical can of worms that doesn't need to be opened. Why make this more complicated than it needs to be? Simply doing designated sandbox zones makes this whole thing much easier for everyone, especially the QA team. Now let's talk about player progression. This right here is a major area where people with a nostalgia bias for Oblivion will often want something different than most players. They tend to be fans of the old school RPG systems where you pick a playstyle and stick to it. They see it as an extension of role-playing. But younger gamers nowadays tend to like the simple systems of games like Fallout 4 much better, precisely because they require less planning. I think Fallout 4's player progression is by far the best Bethesda's ever done. It just rewards us for playing, it's not hard to level up, and there's no level cap. We don't have to spend big amounts of time looking at that screen trying to figure out what to do because there will always be another perk, which makes it so there are no wrong decisions. All that equals a system where the player spends very minimal time planning and lots of time playing. It enhances content and doesn't contract from it. Another important trend a lot of developers are following right now is making leveling up less time consuming, and that's because players just grind anyway. For example, Game Freak started putting those XP candies in Pokemon because they realized that there's no benefit in forcing players to endlessly challenge the Elite Four over and over to get Pokemon to level 100 when they could just make it easier. And since it doesn't take so much time to get your Pokemon to level 100 anymore, players can spend more time doing things like battling other players, shiny hunting, doing raid battles with people, and all that fun stuff. What Game Freak did here is they came up with a system that's less tedious and gets players to the fun faster. For Starfield's player progression, Bethesda essentially grounded unlocking perks in our actual experience of the game, which I thought was a good idea. But sadly, I don't like it as much as I expected to, because in reality, it's not that different from regular XP grinding. We're just grinding specific things in the game instead of points. So I was stuck on this for a while because there is something about this that works and could be an asset to the game. And eventually I figured it out. The mistake is making this the player progression system. So my proposal to Bethesda here is to retool this idea of being rewarded for having specific experiences in the game as something that unlocks aesthetics, not perks. As in, maybe if you kill 100 enemies with a sword, you unlock a new finisher animation, or if you survive 100 battles, you unlock a new scar and character creation. And something right out of Fallout 4, perhaps finding certain items in the game unlocks new decorations to use in the sandbox. I like how these ideas would reward us for playing in ways that we won't expect, and players that aren't interested in this borderline completionist sort of thing aren't really missing out on much. And the Oblivion lovers can still choose to play old school if they want to. They can play a character as, say, a Nightblade all the way through if they want to, it's just their personal choice as opposed to something the game forces. Something I recall Todd Howard talking about in his interview with Lex Friedman is that people often say that they took the role-playing out of Skyrim. But in reality, what they did is they grounded role-playing in the gameplay. It's still there, it's just in choices, like dialogue options, what kinds of weapons you choose to use, etc. And this new school way of thinking is really much more appropriate for how most people actually do play these games nowadays. You know, it used to be for an open world RPG, you wouldn't necessarily do every single quest and every single quest line and all that, but nowadays most people do. Not everyone's a completionist, but yeah, you do every quest line and look to do every quest. So yeah, this new school approach to player progression makes it so, say, we're not locked into using a sword for the College of Winterhold questline. It makes it so we can choose to play how we want when we want. For Skyrim, Bethesda grounded role-playing in our actual decisions, rather than having it be this thing that the game forces upon us. And that made Skyrim approachable to a wider audience in addition to the classic RPG fans that already played Elder Scrolls games. So that's how Bethesda should approach player progression and role-playing in ES6. Don't force anything upon us, let us choose to play how we want when we want, don't make progressing too difficult, and don't cap us to make sure there are never any wrong decisions. Fans with a nostalgia bias for games like Oblivion may complain, but that's nothing to worry about, just let them complain. Things like not picking a class at the start of the game are not going to be the difference between them enjoying Elder Scrolls 6 and not enjoying it. The content will be the deciding factor there. But there are a lot of younger gamers out there that will take one look at a complicated system like the Oblivion classes and be like, this is too much for me, I'm out. Which is what I did when I first looked at Oblivion. I only ever played that game because I could mod it. And that right there is another big reason why lots of developers are making player progression easier. They're recognizing that their fan bases need to get younger. Bethesda's fan base is mainly people that were about middle school or early high school age when Skyrim came out. So they definitely need to get a bunch of people ages 11 to 15 to play Elder Scrolls 6, and modern player progression will be key to that. Now let's talk about things that people whose favorite Elder Scrolls game is Skyrim prefer about other Bethesda games. I asked around in some Discord servers, some friend circles I'm in, and I of course contributed. Here are some things that came up. The previous games had spellcrafting mechanics, but for Skyrim they decided to go with a smithing mechanic instead. There's a pretty big consensus that we liked the spellcrafting better. I find that when I play Oblivion or Morrowind, I really don't miss being able to craft my own weapons and armor, but when I play Skyrim, I really do miss being able to create my own spells. However, that's mainly because the spells we get just aren't good enough. Particularly the destruction spells, they just aren't practical to use against tough enemies. So is bringing the spellcrafting back really the right course of action here? I see why Bethesda decided to part ways with it. What's the point in having us make the same OP Fire Blast and Maximum Light for longest duration possible spells over and over when they could just give us the spells? Really, I think the most logical fix here is to raise the ceiling. If Bethesda's not going to let us craft our own super OP explosions, then they need to just give them to us. But of course, if they are considering taking combat to the next level, like I suggested earlier, then they need to consider how magic factors into all that too. As for the smithing, I'm indifferent to it, but I definitely would not do away with the aesthetic of seeing blacksmiths actually work. Animations like those are very enriching aesthetics, but they don't have to be more than mere aesthetics. Another thing I asked about is lockpicking. I much prefer the lockpicking game that Oblivion and the DSO use to the one that Skyrim and the Fallouts use. It takes a bit of strategizing, and there's a bit of variety to it. However, I actually got very mixed responses from other fans about this. So I gave it some thought, and it's really not out of the question to do both lockpicking games and just have it vary per lock. These little minigames aren't hard to make, and that extra bit of variety would make lockpicking feel a bit more justified as a skill. So I guess use your best judgment here, Bethesda. And believe it or not, there is something I prefer about ESO to Skyrim. I like how the amount of damage weapons do and the amount of resistance armor has is a separate thing from how the given item actually looks. It makes it so we can look the way we want without it ever being inconvenient. So Bethesda, please go this route for Elder Scrolls 6. I like this much better than every player looking the same because we're all just wearing the best armor possible. Moving on, something that's been debated a lot recently is dialogue. Players are very divided on the voice protagonists of Fallout 4, but rather than get into that right now, I'm just going to cut to the chase and say that's definitely not going to work in Elder Scrolls, because to account for the various accents you need at least 6 voice actors recording every one of the protagonist's lines, which simply does not make any practical sense. But how should Bethesda approach dialogue in Elder Scrolls 6? Well folks, of all the Bethesda games, my favorite dialogue by a long shot is Skyrim's. I like how it feels like an extension of the world around us, and I dislike how the face-to-face dialogue systems from some of their other games make us feel removed from the world around us. I was so happy when they sent that Starfield update out that lets us turn off that awful face-to-face camera. When I booted up Starfield again after a long while to start getting ready for Shattered Space, the very first thing I did was turn off that stupid camera, and you know what? It instantly made my experience so much better. However, I know some people like getting a close look at the NPC's reactions, so if it's not too much trouble, I suggest sticking with giving us the option to choose, but launch with it, don't add it later. But if it is a more complicated thing to execute than I realized, to go without the dialogue camera, because that way people that do like the face-to-face dialogue can just get closer to who they're talking to. But the other way around, players that don't like the face-to-face dialogue would be forced to deal with it. Next, let's talk about persuasion. So I like what Bethesda tried to do with Starfield's persuasion, but it just feels, I guess the word is fake. I guess it's similar to what I said about the face-to-face dialogue. It just feels unnatural, makes us feel removed from the experience. Something that would help is taking out the little sounds that play with it. Those make me very aware that I'm playing a game as opposed to experiencing a world. Honestly though, even without the sounds, I think I would still like Skyrim's better, but I'm open to either thing in the S6. Now I want to discuss exploration for a minute. It's a word that often comes up when discussing Bethesda games, and often isn't used accurately. Fans often assert that exploration is like the driving force behind playing Bethesda games, but that simply is not true. Questing is the driving force behind playing Bethesda games, always has been, always will be. Most of the exploration we do in Bethesda games happens when we're following a quest marker to a place we haven't discovered yet, or when we see something we want to get a closer look at after exiting a dungeon, and other situations like that. It's an accessory to questing, not the other way around. With Starfield, Bethesda tried to build the game around pointless wandering. We choose to wander in other Bethesda games because there is a point to it. There's quests to find out there, there's interactions to have in the world that are planned and not procedural, there's clues for mysteries out there like I keep talking about, there's a point to the wandering, it's not mindless. But for Starfield, Bethesda chose to treat exploration as its own thing as opposed to an accessory to the quest, and that just hindered content and frankly made exploration worse. Because part of the beauty of it in games like Skyrim and Fallout 4 is that it was incidental. It wasn't something that the developers tried to force, it just happened on its own. So I'm not saying that exploration isn't part of Bethesda games, it is. But it's not something that Bethesda should spend time catering to. As long as they're designing a beautiful, rich world with lots of handcrafting, interesting quests, and engaging mysteries around every corner, players will explore and enjoy the experience. So Bethesda, don't spend time dwelling over exploration, let it be incidental. Just make sure you're following CD Projekt Red's 40-second rule with your map and doing the rest of what I've recommended in these videos, and exploration will take care of itself. The last thing I have to say is please, no mandated survival mechanics. When I streamed my first time playing Fallout 76, I almost let the F word slip out when I realized I had to maintain my weapons and armor. I just do not understand what anyone likes about this. To me, it's this tedious chore that does nothing to make the experience more fun. When I play Fallouts 3 and 4, I always use mods and console commands to make it so I never have to put up with the nonsense of maintaining my weapons, fixing up my power armor, and repairing my settlements after they get attacked. Well, really, I use mods to make it so my settlements never get attacked anyway, but you get the idea. This is the perfect thing to end with because it encompasses a lot of what I've addressed in this video. These survival mechanics, they're these old school features that they intend to add some realism, which some players do like, but most players find mechanics like that irritating. And a huge part of why Skyrim is so massively popular, especially compared to other Bethesda games, is because they didn't do things exactly like this. They made Skyrim simple to play and moved away from tedious old school mechanics. And the old schoolers did complain a bit, but the fact that Skyrim was and still is to this day Bethesda's most successful game ever is proof that moving on from that old school mindset was the correct decision. The bottom line here is there are more new schoolers than old schoolers. So let the old schoolers complain about how they miss things like Oblivion's class system, Fallout 3's repair mechanics, and other things like that. As long as the content is good, they will enjoy Elder Scrolls 6, just like they enjoyed Skyrim. And you know, I absolutely would play 76 if I could just do the quests and not have to put up with these tedious mechanics that I'm not interested in. I don't understand why they've never made some sort of aesthetic or story mode for people like me. There's a huge number of gamers out there that would give 76, and frankly I think ESO would play through too if they could just do the quests and not worry about Sandbox, survival, multiplayer, or anything other than the quests. Frankly, I would not be surprised at all if doing something like that doubled the amount of players that play those two games. And with that, it's time to wrap up, folks. Everything I've covered in this video and the last one, that's what I think will make Elder Scrolls 6 as big a success as possible. Bethesda needs to return to their Skyrim fundamentals. A large, but not infinite map that's loaded to the brim with quality, rich content, endless amounts of mystery, cities brimming with flavored characters to interact with each other, and all that beautiful stuff that makes Skyrim so magical. And if Bethesda takes everything I've said in these two videos to heart, then I truly believe that ES6 will win Game of the Year easily, and that once it's been out for a few months, it will start averaging 30,000 concurrent players on the Steam charts. So as we're wrapping up here, I want to go over some channel announcements. So as a lot of you know, my main niche is the mystery videos I do, where I break down a big lore thing like the Skyforge, for instance, and I've been deviating from that a little bit recently, so I want to be clear that those are not gone. No, I will always be doing the mystery videos. The reason that I've been experimenting a bit is because I need to grow. I have hit this sort of make or break phase in my YouTube career, so yeah, like every September, I guess it was September, I decided to try it for the first time, so that's sort of the year benchmark for me. Every year I look at what I'm doing and I evaluate. I say, okay, so where am I at now? Does it really make sense for me to continue doing this? And so far it has made sense. You guys have shown me that if I keep investing in this, there is a significant chance that I make it, that I become a big name. So yeah, so I am putting another year in. That's what I decided this September, and you know, that's because of you guys. I do it mainly based on finances. Like, do I think I can make it another year, and can I realistically expect that I'll grow, that it might be worth it to the point that it's worth sticking to. So if it were not for you guys supporting me by watching my videos, I would be broke right now. I was not going to make it another year from 2 Septembers ago if you guys were not watching my videos. But yeah, because I had a decent stretch there, I was financially comfortable going another year. So yeah, thank you to every one of my supporters, my subscribers, people that haven't subscribed yet but watch my videos. You guys saved me a little bit there. I would have had to go find another job if it were not for you guys. So the issue with the mystery videos in terms of growth is those take me a long time to make, and they're not as SEO friendly as the list style videos. The reason that I did these two videos is because, like I said at the end of the last one, I am concerned for the future of Bethesda. So I'm doing what I can to help. I know I'm not a game developer, but I am an expert on Bethesda. So yeah, I'm trying my best to help. And I hope they can at least consider what I had to say, and as game developers themselves and experts on themselves, I hope they figure it out. But I know that the bulk of you subscribe for the mystery videos. I have not forgotten that. So what we'll do here is we'll set a benchmark. How about when I hit 10,000 subs, I'll send out a poll and have you guys vote between the original Dawnguard, what's making the fog worse in Far Harbor, a Volume 2 to the Great Serpent video, and I'm not sure how to title this one, but like a Shalador's Secrets kind of video. So yeah, when I hit 10,000 subs, I'll send that out, and whichever one wins will be the next video. So I'm not sure what the next video is going to be. I actually was going to do 10 secret choices in Fallout 4, but Juicehead just did that, so I may do something else now, but I'll keep you posted. I also want to be sure to tell you guys about Fallout for Hope. For those who don't know, Fallout for Hope is a charity initiative that raises money through Fallout-themed content for a couple of causes. Right now we're fundraising for St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. So if you're interested in possibly making a donation or just finding out more, there's a link to my Tiltify campaign in the description below. So that's all for this one, folks. That's what I think Bethesda needs to do to make Elder Scrolls 6 as big a success as possible. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. Yeah, please hit that like button, check out my socials, particularly Twitter. I'm really looking to get that Twitter following rolling. Yeah, again, thanks for watching everyone, and I will see you in the next one.